We are still talking about Asa and the kingdom of Judah. And if you'll recall, this is a review slide. There we go. So we talked about this on Sunday, that he became king after his father, who was Abijah, and he reigns 41 years, which is the third longest reign. And he overlaps with the first 8 kings of Israel. And he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. And like the last point there, the heart of Asa was wholly true. And I really like this prophet Azariah, who we don't know a whole lot about, when he said, "If you seek the Lord, he will be found. If you forsake him, he will forsake you." And Asa listens in verse 8. And then the Lord gives them rest, and he takes that time to fortify the cities. There's not any wars going on, so he fortifies the cities, and that ends up helping out some. And that's 2 Chronicles 15, which we talked about Sunday, so that's all review. And now we go to the unrest for Asa. If we go back to 2 Chronicles 14, verses 9 through 15, we read about a war. Well, if we let's pick up in verse 8. So we'll read 2 Chronicles 14, starting in verse 8 through 15. And now I will open that up, because I nearly started reading. I was like, you probably don't want to hear me drone on for a little bit. Any volunteers for 2 Chronicles 14, 8 through 15? Look at all these hands, Austin. Who are we going to choose? David. Well, we'll just go bald favoritism.
14, starting in 8. And Asa had an army of 300,000 from Judah, armed with large shields and spears, and 280,000 men from Benjamin that carried shields and drew bows. All these were mighty men of valor. Zerah the Ethiopian came out against them with an army of 1,000,000 men and 300 chariots, and came as far as Maresha. And Asa went out to meet him, and they drew up their lines of battle in the valley of Zephathah at Maresha. And Asa cried to the Lord his God, "O Lord, there is none like you to help between the mighty and the weak. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this multitude. O Lord, you are our God. Let not man prevail against you." So the Lord defeated the Ethiopians before Asa and before Judah, and the Ethiopians fled. Asa and the people who were with him pursued them as far as Gerar, and the Ethiopians fell until none remained alive, for they were broken before the Lord and his army. The men of Judah carried away very much spoil, and they attacked all the cities around Gerar, for the fear of the Lord was upon them. They plundered all the cities, for there was much plunder in them. And they struck down the tents of those who had livestock, and carried away sheep in abundance and camels. Then they returned to Jerusalem.
Excellent. Thank you, David. Just marking this. Start in verse 8 for any future classes, because when we started in verse 8, we learn what Asa comes to the table with, which is no small slouch of an army, 580,000, and all the Benjamites are mighty men of valor, or depending on how you read it, maybe all of them were mighty men of valor, but either way, so a pretty decent army. But then Zerah comes up, and he's got 1,000,000 of them with 300 chariots, so nearly 2 to 1. That's pretty overwhelming. So Asa, remember who we read, heart was wholly true to the Lord, rather than be like, "We got this, come on boys." He cries out to God, and he says, "We rely on you. O Lord, there is none like you to help." This is verse 11. "None like you to help between the mighty and the weak. Help us, O Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this multitude." So then verse 12, the Lord defeated the Ethiopians. It doesn't say Asa through his tactical mind or through the cunning and strength of the mighty men of valor. No. The Lord defeats the Ethiopians. Turns away this giant army and they slaughter them. Enough that they're looting the cities where they're running to. So this is a mighty victory that the Lord brings them. Any comments? Austin, go first, and then Ephraim.
I like the point about the Lord defeating the Ethiopians, and I wanted to tie that back to when we saw Abijah fighting against Jeroboam. There it said the same thing. It didn't say that Abijah or Judah defeated the northern kingdom. It said the Lord defeated Jeroboam for the southern kingdom. And I think that's kind of a big theme for the southern kingdom at this point is they're trusting in God, and God is with them, and he's protecting them and fighting their battles for them like he said they would if they served him.
Right. When you seek the Lord, he will be found. So Ephraim, and then...
I think it's also interesting looking at verse 8. We were talking about the size of the army that Asa had, but it's looking at verse 9. Zerah, the Ethiopian, had also 300 chariots. How many chariots did Asa have?
Right. And
I just think it's interesting that it points that out as well. You know, the 300, yes, million soldiers, but chariots also.
On top, right.
You know, that's like, you know, our army having the tanks.
Right.
A1M1.
It's their armored division?
Yes.
Yeah, that's well pointed out, yes. Go ahead, Dad.
Oh, sorry, I'm blind on that eye. This is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. Not because I don't like Ethiopians, but in life, you know, you got work, you got normal life problems when you get home, all of that. It's like the million Ethiopians around you, and all you have to do is pray, and God will take your hand, and He's not going to dissolve your problem, but he'll help you beat them one at a time.
Right. When you rely on the Lord.
Yeah, that's it. Rely on the Lord. That's the theme that I see here.
No, that's a good point. Nice. Anybody else? Excellent comments. I was really afraid everyone would be like, I'm too tired to talk, Mark. You just read. So I appreciate this. Let's move on to the next one. I know you're thinking, oh, surely there's not going to be another point on there. But lo, there is. Let's skip all the way to 2 Chronicles 16. We've already looked at chapter 15. So we'll look at 16, 1 through 6. And we have a war against Israel with Syria here. So anybody want to read 2 Chronicles 16, 1 through 6? Any volunteers? Thank you, John.
Figured I was close. So. In the 36th year of the reign of Asa, Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might permit no one to go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. Then Asa took silver and gold from the treasures of the house of the Lord and the king's house, and sent them to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, who lived in Damascus, saying, There is a covenant between me and you, as there was between my father and your father. Behold, I am sending to you silver and gold. Go, break your covenant with Baasha, king of Israel, that he may withdraw from me. And Ben-Hadad listened to King Asa, and sent the commanders of his armies against the cities of Israel. And they conquered Ijon, Dan, Abel, Maim, and all the store cities of Naphtali. And when Baasha heard of it, he stopped building Ramah and let his work cease. Then King Asa took all Judah, and they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, with which Baasha had been building, and with them he built Geba and Mizpah.
Okay, so maybe not officially a war, but there is enmity here between Judah and Israel. because of this building up of Ramah, which is to basically separate the kingdom of Judah from the kingdom of Israel. And that's very similar to Jeroboam. It's like, I don't want you going to Jerusalem so that you remember that, oh, yeah, David was supposed to be, the line of David was supposed to be the kings, so I'm going to throw up these calves and you will worship the Lord here. And then Baasha just going to build this fort, and he's going to prohibit the people from going down. And then what's also interesting, I think the worst note here is verse 2. It's not that Asa took silver and gold from the treasury and bribed the king of Syria. Where did he get that from? God. So, remember, he was wholly true to the Lord, set his focus on the Lord, and here we start to see him in declination in that regard. And I think this is the first step toward him not falling away. I won't say that, but his making some poor decisions. So the other thing I think is interesting too is if you have an ally that can be bought, that's sketchy ally. I'm not really on board with that from a tactical standpoint either, although I was never in that situation, but that just seems a horrible way to ally. And I know it's been done historically, but for Asa to take the silver and gold from the treasures of the house of the Lord and also the king's house, but then sends them to Syria to buy them off, to be like, hey, I know you're buddies with Israel, but here's some treasure to look the other way. Okay. And so this alliance switches from Syrian, Israeli, I don't know, the kingdom of Israel and Syria's alliance switched to Syria and Judah. So that's it for this slide, and then we'll look at the fallout from this alliance here on the next one. Questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, it's interesting that he turned to God before when the Ethiopian army invades, but now Israel has invaded and taken a little bit of the north part of Judah, and he reacts so differently. But I think that's what makes a lot of these kings so real, because we do the same thing. Sometimes we really rely on God, and sometimes we rely on ourselves. But I draw great encouragement from the fact that he's still described as being righteous, even though we see some very stark flaws in Asa, and that gives me hope.
Amen. And that's why I don't think the scriptures are lying when it says was wholly true and did what was right in the sight of the Lord. He just made some poor decisions here later. And I think that's another valid point, Aaron, is that we talked about him reigning for 41 years. And so this is later, much later in his life. And when we're just reading it, it's Chronicles 15 to Chronicles, or starting in 14 to 16. And it sums up this 41-year reign in 2.5, 3 chapters. So it's I think that's difficult for us. Like, I'm a history student, and this would, the reign of a king of 41 years would probably be a mighty book, if not 2 volumes. And here we get a little bit. So that's kind of difficult for us to weigh that when we start at the beginning of his reign and then some things happen and all of a sudden we're at the end. And I think I'm drawing that out from Aaron's point, that this is a long life. A lot of things happen. And so it's not like at the beginning he's a young man and he listens to the prophet and then this happens and he just magically forgets. It's several years in between, things like that. And heavy is the head that wears the crown, they say. Maybe that was some of it. Good point. John?
I was just thinking from a practical standpoint, as you, I think, mentioned Sunday, or it might have been before that, but that we don't have all the details of everything that's happened. So we don't know anything else that's going on right now in his life and what's going on in the kingdom and what's going on in his home.
Right.
Who knows what all stresses he's been dealing with over some period of time. And then this comes up, and, is it a buildup of things that then he has weak moment? I mean, we don't know all of that stuff. I mean, when we go through life, we know, oh, yeah, I did it. And, oh, yeah, but I was going through this and this and that. And, we have our excuses maybe that we might use in that regard, but we don't really know anything. I say, we don't know a lot else going on right now.
No, that's well pointed out. I think that ties in with your point, Dad, that when you start to get overwhelmed and you don't rely on God, you just start overwhelming, and then you just start trying to figure stuff out. And you don't tackle it one at a time. You just try not to drown. And maybe you're right, John, maybe that's going on in Asa's life, because Aaron's right to point out that Israel's coming down and they're slowly taking bits, and maybe he's like, maybe the Lord has forsaken me. But rather than double down, go to the temple and let's figure all this out, he's like, well, I got some cash. Let's see if I can't buy our way out of this. So if there's nothing else, we'll go staying in 16. We'll just look at a couple of verses as we go. Verses 7 through 9. This is right after the Syrian alliance and Israel stops building in Ramah. Verse 7. At that time, Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah, and said to him, because you relied on the king of Syria and did not rely on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Syria has escaped you. Were not the Ethiopians and the Libyans a huge army with very many chariots and horsemen? Yet because you relied on the Lord, he gave them into your hand. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to give strong support to those whose heart is blameless toward him. You have done foolishly in this, for from now on you will have wars. So this rebuke comes from Hanani the seer, and we don't really know anything else about this man either, just that he's called a seer, and he comes up to, I would say, a pretty mighty king, at least been reigning for a long time, and comes up and says, I got a message for you from the Lord. Remember him? That you relied on Syria and you forgot about the Lord. Don't you remember that 1,000,000-man army who you completely slaughtered and plundered because you cried out to the Lord? He says, you have not. You have done foolishly in this, because the eyes of the Lord are to and fro all over the earth. He's noticing all of this stuff. You can't hide from him. And he gives support to those whose heart is blameless toward him, not necessarily sinless, but when you're blameless toward the Lord. Remember, I keep bringing up David because it's easy. It's called a man after God's own heart, yet we read of these horrible sins that he committed, but remained a man after God's own heart. And I almost stole my thunder for the next line. So the seer says this, and then we look. He says, remember the defeat of the Ethiopians. And then in verse 10, then Asa was angry with the seer and put him in the stocks in prison, for he was in a rage with him because of this. And Asa inflicted cruelties upon some of the people at the same time. So since I brought up David, remember, Nathan comes to David and he tells him the story about the poor man with the one sheep that was like his own child, and his rich neighbor who had a big flock takes the poor man's sheep, slaughters it, and David flies off the handle. He's like, that man's going to pay. He's going to pay big time. And then Nathan says, it's you. You're that guy. And David realizes his sin, and he repents, and he bows before God. You know, he lowers himself. Asa does the opposite here. he receives this message and he doesn't be like, wow, man, you're right. I need to change my ways. It's like, prison with you. And then inflicts cruelties on the people, which we don't really know a whole lot about, but that's just kind of an interesting addition as well. Whether they were saying the same things or he just decided that he was going to recoup his losses and tax them into the ground. I don't know.
I wonder if Nathan had come to David and just accused him straight up, would David have still repented the same way? And if Hanani had come to Asa with the story instead of just flat out accusing him, would it have been different? I don't know. Either way, there's a lesson for us that,
Right.
One, that we need to be responsive to criticism, but also when we're going to someone, tact can go a long way.
I agree. I guess I've always, and this might be the little kid reading of this, but I just assume that the Lord says, I want you to go say these words to that guy. And that might be that the Lord said, all right, David needs to not be tricked, but he needs to think about this for a minute and then come at him, get him with the old razzle dazzle. And thank you. That's all I need, just to giggle every now and again. And then he comes, you're right, comes at Asa with the direct approach, and that's probably how I would react to Asa. Sorry, buddy. You're right. So, but I think you have a valid point for us. Yes, some tact is involved, and I think that's why we get to know each other, especially if we need to help correct or help encourage. It's a lot easier to know how to do that when you know each other. That's a side point. But either way, Asa throws the seer into prison, and then we'll just read through the end of the chapter here if there's nothing else. Verse 11, the acts of Asa from first to last are written in the book of Kings of Judah and Israel. In the 39th year of his reign, remember he reigned 41 years, the 39th year of his reign, Asa was diseased in his feet, and his disease became severe. Yet even in his disease, he did not seek the Lord, but sought help from physicians. And so, I read a handful of commentators. Some people think it's gout, and then another group of them say gout's not common there, so it's probably not diabetes, but sometimes when you get diabetes, it ruins your circulation in your extremities, and so that's why a lot of times if you have severe diabetes, you'll lose your feet. Anyway, there's something circulatory possibly here, and that it's just making his feet diseased, possibly gangrenous. Anyway, this is a bad deal. But here, when he's inflicted with this, he's looking for doctors to help and remedies rather than going to the Lord. And so we have the two or three strikes against him, depending on how you want to count. He makes the alliance with Syria. He is told that's a foolish plan, and he imprisons the prophet, the seer, and then he seeks doctors rather than the Lord, which I don't think that is saying not to seek a doctor at all, but that he should have inquired of the Lord and then sought doctors. And then the cruelties could be a fourth point. But these are all kind of strikes at the end of Asa's storied career. But I think with all of that, when we read these last two verses, I think there's great hope for Asa, and I don't think those words are wasted. It said he was holy with the Lord, and his heart was true to the Lord. Because, in verse 13, Asa slept with his fathers dying in the 41st year of his reign. They buried him in the tomb that he had cut for himself in the city of David. They laid him on a bier that had been filled with various kinds of spices prepared by the perfumer's art, and they made a very great fire in his honor. So he was a great king for the people. in spite of those cruelties that it mentions, they still do this great big honor for him. There we go. I'm awful at this clicking portion. So he's honored in death, and that is the end of the long reign of Asa.
So, based on your comment you just made, would that be? I know there's not any explicitness, but a hint of seeing perhaps maybe God's mercy in play. Understanding that mercy is when we don't get what we deserve.
Possibly, and there's mercy involved, and then there's this is a hope of mine that God looks at your entire life. But I don't know. But the Bible, and even I'm sure the children might have already passed this, but Asa is considered a good king, a godly king. So overall, I think he seems. I don't think that's wasted at the early life of his. That it talks about wholly seeking the Lord, and then maybe wavered a little bit, maybe wavered too much for God, but I don't know. Awesome.
I think with the story of Hananiah the seer coming in, there are some really good lessons about weighing the short term versus the long term, and God knowing better than man and how things should go. So you read the account, and King Asa makes the alliance with Syria, and we read the result of that is Syria goes and messes with Israel, and they have to stop the project, and Asa gets the materials to build a couple of towns. And then God sends Hananiah to Asa and says, I could have given you the king of Syria, man, but he escaped from you because you did this, and now you're going to have wars from now on for the rest of your reign potentially, because you made this one bad choice. And so we think about, in the short term, Asa's plan actually worked, but he could have had so much more if he had followed God. And I think that's something for us to think about. Sometimes, I know I've done this before, where it's like, oh, I know how I can fix the situation. It's easy. It's not easy. It doesn't work. I mean, if I just prayed about it and reflected a little more, I bet it would have gone a lot better than what I tried to do.
And that not being able to, I always talk about people as a general rule don't look more than 10 minutes into the future. And I think that happens with that point. I think I thought of Moses when you were talking, that Moses had one simple command, and he's like, oh, I'm going to strike this rock. Water still came out, but Moses paid a pretty heavy price, in, I think, common opinion, for not following God's explicit command there. Like, okay, the water's coming out. You're not going into the promised land. And I wonder how much that weighed on Moses. But going back again, Moses is considered what we called it, the Mount Rushmore in the Hebrews class, on the Mount of Transfiguration, the law bringer, but was still Aaron and Ephraim. That'd be.
Referenced Ephraim's question. It's an interesting question. There's a lot of debate over, was Asa righteous and then he fell away or not. You're right, Scripture calls him righteous, even though it's clearly at the very end of his life lists things he did wrong. But the only time in all the kings of Judah that it says someone did right and then clearly fell away was Joash, the young king. And it says he did right as long as the priest Jehoiada was alive. There's no caveat in Asa. It just says he did right.
Right.
And while it's clearly God's judgment, I think that is God's judgment. God said he was righteous. So I think it would be, I'm uncomfortable going beyond what God clearly states there.
I agree.
It's interesting that you reminded us about Moses. Well, you go into Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, and looking at chapter 11 and all these people where you saw great things and not so great things. But just like a lot of these other people, Moses was explicitly, highlighted. I think at least 3 verses in Hebrews chapter 11. So we kind of have a sort of more sound
True.
thought process based upon the truth that's there in Scripture in terms of where his soul ended up.
Right. Anything else about Asa? We're moving on. Doesn't want me to move that way. We'll go to Jehoshaphat, who we've talked about because of some things he did with Israel. I don't know what's going on with this. Anyways, we'll go to 1 Kings. Then we'll get back to Chronicles, I promise. 1 Kings 22. Verse 41. So, 22:41 of 1 Kings. Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, began to reign over Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Azubah, the daughter of Shilhi. He walked in all the way of Asa his father. He did not turn aside from doing it, doing what was right in the sight of the Lord. So I think that kind of helps out Asa's case as well, that this is included again, that maybe the Lord did have mercy. And so Jehoshaphat, like we've been talking about, he does right in the sight of the Lord, as said, according to Asa and according to David. Okay. Let's make sure I didn't miss anything. Now we'll go back to 2 Chronicles, and we'll talk about the Lord blessing him. 2 Chronicles 17. 2 Chronicles 17, verses 5 and 6, and then we'll skip down to 9 through 11. Therefore the Lord established the kingdom in his hand, and all Judah brought tribute to Jehoshaphat. And he had great riches and honor. His heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord. And furthermore, he took the high places and the Asherim out of Judah. And then we'll jump down, because he talks about a lot of the Levites, and that's important, but we're focusing on the kings here. Verse 9, and all these Levites, he commands to teach in the cities. In verse 9, they taught in Judah, having the book of the law of the Lord with him. They went about through all the cities of Judah and taught among the people. And the fear of the Lord fell upon all the kingdoms of the lands that were around Judah, and they made no war against Jehoshaphat. Some of the Philistines brought Jehoshaphat presents and silver for tribute, and the Arabians also brought him 7,700 rams and 7,700 goats. He talks about, and he grows greater as a king and as the kingdom. So read, first and foremost, he's following like Asa. And he's like David in this regard. His heart was courageous in the Lord. I really like that phrase. I think that's it's just really cool. I like it. Courageous in the Lord. It's so forceful. And then he gets rid of the high places, gets all the Asherim out of there, all the wooden carven images of the goddesses and things like that, which I am reading, and there, I'm just going to bring them all up. There we go. And then most importantly, he sends all of these names that we skipped over, all of those names, sends them out into the kingdom and commands them to teach the law. And I think we see, especially in the northern kingdom, why they had such troubles is because they didn't remember the law. They're like, oh, we'll worship God, but we'll do it with these calves. and all the priests and Levites leave, so they're just making it up as they go. And that's not what God wants. You've laid out the law. Here, Moses, give the law to the people. And so they had the law, and they just ignored it. And we'll see that in the future, too, that they'll kind of meander away and then rediscover the law, and things go better for them. So this is a strong lesson. When you learn the law, when you know the law, when you know the will of God, things go better for you. And I don't think that is a lesson just for these kings and this kingdom. I think that's a lesson for all of us. That's why we're all here on a Wednesday. To learn more about the will of God, to know His law, to know His statutes, to know more about Him, so that we might be pleasing to Him. And then, because of this blessing of the Lord, that the fear of the Lord falls around all the kingdoms around. So much that the Philistines, the ancient enemy, are bringing tribute. And then the Arabians also. And this is a pretty hefty sum of livestock. And so he's growing greater and greater because the Lord is with him. Any comments on what we've read or what we looked at so far?
I really like verse 6, talking about his heart was courageous in the ways of the Lord. One of the things we talked about in my dad's United Kingdom class was we usually think of courage just as a good thing generally, but we read about in that United Kingdom class, Absalom told his servants, be strong and courageous in murdering Amnon, I think his name was. And so here he checks the box for courageous, but he also checks the box for he's channeling it in the right direction in the ways of the Lord. And I think that's something that we should try to do as well.
Very good point. Very good. You're right. Anybody else feeding off of that? Still in 2 Chronicles, still chapter 17, verses 12 through 19. Jehoshaphat grew steadily greater. He built in Judah fortresses and store cities. He had large supplies in the cities of Judah. He had soldiers, mighty men of valor in Jerusalem. This was the muster of them by the fathers' houses. And it goes, and he's got of Judah, the commanders of thousands was Adnah with 300,000 mighty men of valor. And next to him, Jehohanan, the commander, with 280,000. And next to him, Amasiah, the son of Zichri, a volunteer for the service of the Lord, with 200,000 mighty men of valor. Of Benjamin, Eliada, a mighty man of valor, with 200,000 men armed with bow and shield. And next to him was Jehozabad, with 180,000 armed for war. These were in the service of the king, besides those whom the king had placed in the fortified cities throughout all of Judah. So, he's using this courageous for the Lord of, all right, let's fortify Judah because it's not getting any less violent around us. And the Lord is looking out for us now, so let's take advantage of this. Builds many fortified cities, and then has 1,160,000 men in his army, plus garrison troops. And that's the way I added it up because I checked the math. And that's a substantial force. I know we talked about the Ethiopians, and then we learned later it's Ethiopian and Libyans. I was looking at, I should have brought this up when we were talking about it, but I forgot. Another commentary said that the Ethiopian leader was probably a general in Egypt, so maybe there was a North African army coming up against Asa. But anyways, Jehoshaphat's got a mighty force as well. And that is self-explanatory. So unless there's any comments, I will obviously allow that. Let's go to chapter 19. And we'll just talk about real quick some other things Jehoshaphat does. He overhauls the judicial system, which is interesting, so we'll read it here. Chapter 19, 2 Chronicles 19, verses 5 through 11. He appointed judges in all the land and all the fortified cities of Judah, city by city. Said to the judges, consider what you do, for you judge not for man, but for the Lord. He is with you in giving judgment. Now then, Let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Be careful what you do, for there is no injustice with the Lord our God, or partiality, or taking bribes. Moreover, okay, make sure I wasn't reading too far, sorry. Moreover, in Jerusalem, Jehoshaphat appointed certain Levites and priests and heads of families of Israel to give judgment for the Lord and to decide disputed cases. And they had their seat at Jerusalem, and he charged them, "Thus you shall do in the fear of the Lord in faithfulness and with your whole heart. Whenever a case comes to you from your brothers who live in their cities concerning bloodshed, law, or commandment, statutes or rules, then you shall warn them that they may not incur guilt before the Lord, and wrath may not come upon you and your brothers. Thus you shall do, and you'll not incur guilt. And behold, Amariah, the chief priest, is over you in all matters of the Lord, and Zebediah, son of Ishmael, governor, in all the king's matters, and the Levites." And then the last line, "Deal courageously, and may the Lord be with the upright." So if you notice over and over again, when the king's given these commandments out, he's like, all right, I want you all to be judges. But you consider what you do, because you are not judging for man. You're an agent of the Lord. You are judging for the Lord in verse 6. He is with you. Let the fear of the Lord be upon you, and be careful what you do. And I really like the end of verse 7 there, because there's no injustice with the Lord or partiality, and there's no taking bribes. Because we've seen throughout history, and I don't know, maybe current times, I don't know, I don't keep up with judges, but how taking bribes could be detrimental to dispensing justice. So Jehoshaphat cuts that down. It's like, remember, the Lord's watching you, the Lord is with you, so don't wreck this. And then he sends out the Levites, certain Levites, priests, head of families, and gives them other cases and gives them a similar command. You are doing this in the fear of the Lord and faithfulness. And then at the very, very end, deal courageously, and may the Lord be with the upright. So we see throughout this, I'm kind of stating it over and over again, how faithful Jehoshaphat is. And all his reforms aren't coming because he wants to be the greatest king in the kingdom, that he's going to displace the name of David as the royal line. He keeps mentioning the Lord, courageous for the Lord. And he tells the judges, you are working for the Lord. As the Lord, you are going to make these decisions. And keeps reminding them. Sends the priests out, the Levites out, to teach the law for the Lord, so that people may know the Lord. So before this, I guess I just skimmed over this. And that might be why I'm so impressed with King Jehoshaphat right now. It's just a name a lot of times, but he's such a great king.
What impressed me about him is it's not just him doing it. He's putting infrastructure in place so that it will reach down to the people. It's not just him being righteous. He's concerned about their spiritual leadership. So he organizes these Levites to do it. The military is not just that he has a big army. He's establishing these sub-commanders so that they can organize their men into groups. And then the judicial system, he's got a secular system with the judges in the cities, and then a religious judicial system as well. So it's so impressive, his organization skills. And you see a little bit of that with like David and Solomon, but all these other divided kingdoms, there's no infrastructure mentioned really. So it is very impressive.
Right. There's occasional fortification of a town, but this is almost a complete overhaul of the kingdom. And you're right, it's amazing. I don't know why he's not held in higher regard. Maybe he is, I don't know. So a great military leader, the Lord blesses him. However, he does invoke the displeasure of the Lord with a few things. And this we have already talked about when we talked about Ahab. He displeases God by allying with Israel. He allies with King Ahab and also with Ahab's son Ahaziah. All right. And if you remember, when Ahab dies, they're there. And to Jehoshaphat's credit, although the Lord doesn't like him allying with Ahab because Ahab was not a friend of the Lord, as we will look possibly Sunday. Remember, Jehoshaphat is the one who says, "Isn't there a prophet we could consult with before this battle?" And Ahab said, "I got these 400. He goes, No. Isn't there a prophet we could consult?" And he goes, "Well, there's the one guy who I don't really care for." And he was like, "Let's hear from him." And so that's the kind of King Jehoshaphat is, and how he has regard for the Lord, why he wanted to ally with Israel and with Ahab in particular is going to be a disastrous decision for the future. But also remember, when Ahab dies, or at the last battle where Ahab dies, he says, "Jehoshaphat, I'm just going to wear an ordinary soldier's uniform. Why don't you wear the royal robes?" And the army goes after Jehoshaphat because he's dressed like a king, and he cries out to the Lord, and the Lord saves him. And then the random bowman ends up just firing arrows at will, just at whoever is around, and mortally wounds Ahab. So that's what goes on there. And then he does ally again with Ahaziah. And we'll just read this real quick in chapter 20, next one over there, 35 through 37 real quick, and then we'll save is it Jehoram next? Yeah, we'll save Jehoram for Sunday and the remaining kings. 35 through 37, this talks about the end of Jehoshaphat's reign. After this, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, joined with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who acted wickedly. He joined him in building ships to go to Tarshish, which is Spain, essentially. They built the ships in Ezion-Geber. Then Eleazar, the son of Dodavahu of Mareshah, prophesied against Jehoshaphat, saying, "Because you have joined with Ahaziah, the Lord will destroy what you have made." And the ships were wrecked and not able to go to Tarshish. So that's the displeasure of God comes toward the end of Jehoshaphat's reign, because he does business, he allies with Israel, and God doesn't like their wickedness. Anything else real quick about Jehoshaphat? And if you think anything, we got Sunday as well. One last? Well, here, Austin, I got this one.
The major mistake is not just the allying that God's talking about that displeases. It's not just that he made political alliances with. He makes a decision that's going to wind up tanking Judah, and that's because he gives his son in marriage to Ahab's daughter Athaliah, and that's what is eventually going to lead to Judah falling down. So that's what God was furious about, because that was, for such a righteous guy, it's scary as a father that he can be such a good guy and can make such a dumb decision.
Yeah, he sets up a political marriage with Ahab's daughter, and we will see Sunday morning what that sowing will reap, because it is disastrous for the kingdom. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you Sunday morning, Lord willing.